So thanks everybody for coming. I'm Anthony Skelton. I teach philosophy here at Western. And I want to thank everybody for coming today, and also if you've come to the other events that was part of our Wellbeing and Happiness series, I thank you for that. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Our speaker today is Erik Angner. He is currently a professor of practical philosophy at Stockholm University in Stockholm, Sweden, of course. He has 2 PhDs, one in economics and one in philosophy, both from the University of Pittsburgh. He specializes in, I guess, both philosophy of science and also in moral philosophy, social political issues, engaging in particular with a wide range of topics, but in particular well-being, rationality, and social order, and seeking to bring philosophical and other kinds of theories about those issues into contact with the most recent and the most relevant science on them, reviving the great 19th century tradition of not just doing moral philosophy, but what they call the moral sciences, which include political economy and things like that. It's no surprise that some of the great 19th century economists like John Stuart Mill and his father, Bentham, Sidgwick, and others, Edgeworth, were all also really steeped in philosophy. Erik's mission, as I said, is to revive that tradition and to make sure that we learn a lot about it today. He's published many articles in lots of great journals, and also is the author of 2 books. Sorry, last night I said 4 because there's some translations of one of them, including Hayek and Natural Law, which has got 13 citations here, it tells me. Things are much better for his other book, which is A Course in Behavioral Economics, which has got an Italian translation and also a Chinese translation. So markets of vast magnitude are open to him. Today he's going to be talking about why the science of well-being needs the philosophy of well-being, and vice versa. So please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you, Anthony, and for these kind words. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here among so many friends, old and new, and at the Institute, which you guys who are here might not realize, like, what a good name the Institute has internationally. It's really a very well-known and highly regarded institution, so that's great. I'm particularly grateful to those of you who came out last night also and get like a grand total of 4 hours of me speaking about happiness. You're very brave. Today I want to talk about something slightly different, though, from last night. Basically, the project that I want to talk about here represents a sort of massive personal failure. So I started writing a book on happiness like some years back, and I wrote a complete manuscript of like a 300-page book and whatever, and it was almost done. It was pretty much done. And then I organized a little workshop where some people with impeccable judgment, like really nice and good people, came to read my manuscript and give me feedback on it, and like everyone hated it. And so I had the choice between like publishing it fast and hoping nobody would ever see it, or like abandoning the project. And so I decided to just like abandon it. But then over time, I came to see that there was a sort of thread running through the different chapters of the previous book manuscript that might be worth exploring in full, and it has to do with the relationship between science and philosophy. So about the various ways in which the study of the one thing can inform the study of the other. To some extent, I guess that's there because it serves to sort of justify my existence. So as somebody who moves between the sciences and philosophy, I get a lot of questions of the nature, like, what is that? Like, why do you even care? Like, why does philosophy matter? You know, why should I listen to you? And so I spent a lot of time sort of justifying the sort of interdisciplinary work, the attention to the detailed scientific theories and methodology and so on in my philosophy, and the attention to philosophy in my economics. And what I'm trying to do here is sort of synthesize some of these ideas. I'll warn you right away that this what I'm giving you today is sort of like a broad brush picture. Each one of the separate arguments is going to need to be fleshed out in great detail, but I thought nonetheless that it might be interesting to give you like the big picture here, and then we can get back to the details as you see fit, as we see fit. I want to start with a quotation from Bunge, and I think is really nice. He wrote in a paper that hasn't been cited as much as it should have been in 1976, that a vigorous and symmetrical interaction between science and philosophy is desirable to close the gap between the two camps and to develop a scientific philosophy and a science with philosophical awareness. This is sort of like a nice description of what I've been trying to do, like a scientific philosophy and a science with philosophical awareness. The picture that I'm going to defend is a picture that looks a little bit like this, where philosophy and science are not identical, right? They're distinct. There might be like some borderlands in between the two where it's sort of unclear what we're talking about, but nonetheless, it makes sense to individuate or to separate philosophy from science. But I represent them like this side by side to signal that no one of these two disciplines dominates the other or sort of stands above the other, or whatever. These are two separate enterprises that can inform each other in the way that these arrows indicate. So I want to argue that philosophy matters to science and that science matters to philosophy. I'll present this argument in the context of my area, which is the philosophy and science of well-being, but at least some of the points I'll be making are intended to apply more widely, might apply to the sciences quite generally. Because my thesis has two parts, because there are two arrows in this picture, my talk will also be divided in two. And I'll start with what I think of as like the less controversial part of this, certainly I imagine in this audience, which is this idea that philosophy of well-being is relevant to the science of well-being, that philosophical reflection matters even if the only thing you're trying to do is the science of the thing. Okay, first off, would anyone deny that philosophy matters? Yes, people would deny that philosophy matters. Here's my favorite example of this. It's from a UCLA economist, Jack Hirschleifer, who wrote a book called The Dark Side of the Force: Economic Foundations of Conflict Theory, which is about what he calls the economics of the dark side, so the economics of crime and corruption and so on. He's trying to apply sort of traditional economic modeling to these sort of antisocial and in many ways harmful behaviors. Like early on in the book, he has this to say: as we come to explore this continent, the dark side, right, economists will encounter a number of native tribes, historians, sociologists, psychologists, philosophers, and so on, who in their various intellectually primitive ways have preceded us. Once we economists get involved, quite properly, we'll of course be brushing aside these atheoretical aborigines. I want to note right away, like, the decidedly genocidal touch to this passage, right? There's this dark continent, right, that's occupied by these natives, these primitives, right, who need to be brushed aside, you know, the moment the economists arrive and, like, you know, try to make sense of this. And it signals quite clearly, I think, a, shall we say, dismissive attitude to philosophy and these other areas. Now, what's interesting about this is that throughout the book, he cites people from all these different disciplines. And so he notes that he has to explain, like, how it makes sense to cite philosophers and anthropologists and so on, having said this. And so he immediately goes on to say this: how do I reconcile these comments with the undoubted fine work being produced by all these other people? The answer is simple. When these researchers do good work, they're doing economics, right? Notice that philosophers don't even appear in the list of intellectually primitive aborigines in this list, right? But when these people do something that's worthwhile, it's because they're doing economics, right? And they don't get it, they don't even know, right? But what they're doing is economics. And so here's, I think, a good example of somebody who's expressing maybe not like the modal view among economists, but nonetheless a view that's pretty common in my experience. If you hang out with economists, they're like famously arrogant. They cite other fields less than many other people do, right? They're sort of insular in that respect, and so the attitude captured here is not that unusual. But I want to give you now a couple of reasons to think that philosophical reflection is critical, not just like useful at times, but absolutely critical to this kind of enterprise. And not just because philosophers can act as some sort of proto or primitive economist, but that they actually matter as philosophers. Okay, so here we go. So here's the first reason I want to talk about. The first reason is that philosophical literature is actually a goldmine for empirical hypotheses. So if you read classical philosophical literature, I mean, if you read Aristotle or if you read the classical utilitarians or whatever, these texts are full of empirical hypotheses of various kinds. Many of them are actually quite interesting. and many of them have not been picked up by actual scientists. Now, I'm not suggesting we look at Aristotle and just like take his word for it, but if I may use the old-fashioned distinction between a context of discovery and a context of justification, when you're in the context of discovery, you're generating hypotheses to explore. Looking at these philosophers is actually, at least potentially, a pretty good idea. They were acute observers of human nature. They're very perceptive. They spent a lot of time thinking and reading and writing about this. And so we have good reason to pay attention to what they're saying. Now, you don't need to take my word for it. You can take the word of George Lowenstein, for example, who's one of the leading behavioral economists and somebody who's done a lot of work on happiness. He says it's perhaps an indication of the glacial progress of social science that decision researchers and behavioral economists have only recently begun to appreciate the importance of the full range of human motives enumerated by Bentham in the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Right? So Bentham here, this is not an obscure treatise, right? But what he's saying is that there are ideas here that are worth exploring for contemporary scientists that we haven't yet picked up on. And so what this is suggesting is, on the margin, if you're a scientist and you want to pick up on some new ideas to explore, this is a place where you might go. Okay? So that's one reason to pay attention to the philosophers. Now, in this case, it's easy to say that what these philosophers were doing were just like some primitive form of social science, right? Social science didn't exist as such during this era, certainly not during Aristotle's era. But there are other reasons as well. So let me move on to the second reason to think that philosophy matters. So scientists tend to depend on normative and therefore philosophical assumptions to a remarkably large degree. So if you read people who publish on happiness, for example, the policy applications loom large. Very many of the papers will start off with some comment about policy, the deficiency of like GDP as a measure of well-being, the importance of maximizing well-being in our personal lives and in policy and so on. And so these questions about how the world ought to be and what we ought to do to make the world a better place loom very large in the literature. Okay? I'm depending here, obviously, on some sort of distinction between the descriptive and the normative that I imagine you'll endorse as well. There's other ways to sort of capture the same idea. Here's a formulation I like too. This is from Rebecca Goldstein, who says there are two kinds of questions: what is and what matters. I like this formulation because it signals that or it suggests that one of the things that matter to science is what matters to human beings, right? When scientists choose what to study, for example, wouldn't be unusual for scientists to study things that they believe matter, right? But that's an obvious normative question. What are the things that matter? And it's a sort of thing that, as a normative claim, presumably philosophy has something to say about. The principles underlying public policy implications are obviously normative, obviously philosophical in that respect, right? If you're going to get from empirical findings to some sort of policy, you need some sort of normative criterion. You need to assess what it means for an individual to be well off. You need to assess what's good for a society. You need to assess the relative value of maximizing welfare and promoting equality, and you need to assess things that have to do with like justice and fairness and whatnot. And all these questions are clearly philosophical in nature, and they're questions that social scientists, including economists and psychologists, deal with a lot in a way that's by and large not particularly informed by philosophy. So if you read so many of the happiness economists, you'll find people who, without any hesitation, that's obvious from the text, will endorse Bentham as the last word of like moral philosophy. And so Richard Layard, for example, at London School of Economics, will tell you that Bentham was right about maximizing happiness, and we should ruthlessly apply his principle in our personal lives and in policy, right? There's no attention here to the stuff that happened since Bentham and the various complications that people have explored in the philosophical tradition. And I think it would be a good idea if at least some of the people who are relying on these assumptions spent a little more time attending to what their advantages and disadvantages are, what the alternatives might be, and the relative costs and benefits. What else? Well, so here's another thing that matters. I've organized these points, by the way, roughly in order from less to more controversial. So I think like the first couple of claims I'm making you'll agree with quite quickly. Some of the others might be slightly harder to swallow, but I nonetheless think they're true. And so here's one thing. So even purely descriptive scientific research, even the sort of thing that we think about as purely descriptive scientific research, stuff that isn't like immediately policy-oriented and so on, cannot but proceed on the basis of philosophical assumptions. There's a particularly nice line from Dan Dennett here where he says that there's no such thing as philosophy-free science. There's just science that's being conducted without any consideration of its underlying philosophical assumptions. Okay? So what Dennett is getting at is that we don't have the option to do science in a philosophy-free way. The philosophy is there whether we want it to be or not. Right? We can choose to acknowledge it. We can make it explicit. We can explore its advantages and disadvantages, but we don't have the option of getting rid of it. In the context of the science of well-being and science quite generally, one place where this sort of point becomes really important has to do with the concept of measurement. And so it's widely agreed in this literature that in order to do science of something, you have to be able to measure it. And so the people who work on happiness and whatever, I have only rarely come across people who say that it doesn't matter if we can measure it or not. Right? Pretty much everyone will say that, in order to build a science of this, we first have to figure out a way to measure it, but then they proceed to say that we know how to measure it now, and not only just in principle, but we know how to measure it in practice. We know how to do this. I'm not going to explore exactly how the way the argument goes, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that when a scientist makes an argument to the effect that something can be measured, that argument presupposes some sort of conception of what it means to measure something. That contains some sort of conception of what conditions have to obtain for us to legitimately assert that we've succeeded in measuring this thing. And that's a core issue in philosophy of science, right? The concept of measurement is something we've done for 100 years or more. Is one of the central issues in philosophy of science. And if you're a scientist, you want to argue about whether happiness can be measured or not, and they do argue about this, right? It's a big debate between sort of the people who do happiness research and the more orthodox economists, for example. It's a big topic of conversation, and you can't have that conversation, right? You can't assert either one of the standard positions in that literature without making some sort of assumption about what it means to measure something and under what conditions you can say we now have license to assert that we've measured this thing. And so there are all sorts of ways in which sort of standard accounts and theories in philosophy of science pop up in the sciences, and in a way that isn't just incidental, right, but in ways that are absolutely critical. Maybe I should mention right away, because Dan Dennett is on the screen here, that I don't mean to suggest that you have to be a professional philosopher to philosophize, right? In fact, I think there are many scientists who are superior philosophers than some philosophers. But the point here is that there is an activity that we know as philosophy, and you have to engage in that sort of activity, even if the only thing you want to do at the end of the day is the traditional science. Okay? What else? Well, another thing that philosophy does, and that philosophy does well, is to explore conceptual spaces and articulating advantages and disadvantages of occupying various niches in that space. Now, it's true that if you look at the philosophy of well-being, for example, there's not a whole lot of consensus about what the correct view is. And I think this is a large part of the reason why scientists hesitate to go to the philosophical literature. Right? If you come from the outside and you look at philosophy, you see this vast mess of positions and people disagreeing with each other, and you might not see a whole lot of progress over time, right? I don't want to deny that there is progress over time, whatever, but it's true that there's not exactly a consensus among philosophers on the topic of what the nature of well-being is. But there is something that there is not consensus, but a much more agreement about anyways in philosophy of well-being, and that has to do with what the space of live alternatives are. So there are a couple of views out there that have defenders and that have had defenders over the generations. Those options are relatively stable. There are new variations, right, being presented. Every new doctoral dissertation in this area has to add a wrinkle to some of the existing views. But in broad outline, the classes of live views, the views that people take seriously, remain relatively constant. And that's what I'm getting at here. So even if philosophers can't tell everyone what well-being is, what they can tell them, what we can tell the rest of the world is here are some options. Right? Here's some views you might want to take, right? Here's some consistent accounts that you could choose from. And not only that, we also have a pretty good idea of what the advantages and disadvantages are. Right? We have these standard thought experiments that you could use to articulate like what advantage this theory here has over this theory over here. And so there is a great deal of agreement, if not consensus, on like what the options are and what the advantages and disadvantages are. This is actually pretty useful information for a scientist, right? Even if you're like dead set on measuring happiness and arguing that we should maximize happiness, which is fine if you want to do, you can go to this literature and figure out what the advantages are, what the disadvantages are, like what the costs are of going this way. This is useful information, and it's useful for scientific reasons, right? I'm not coming from the outside here telling scientists they ought to be doing something they're not already committed to, right? They are already committed to spelling out their assumptions and assessing advantages and disadvantages and so on. And looking at the philosophical literature can help you do this. It's not even very hard. And so there are these fantastic resources now. So here's the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Well-being that came out a couple of years ago. A couple of us in the room have chapters in here. It outlines in short, concise, well-written chapters like what the main competitors are and what the central issues are in this area and whatever. So the cost to a scientist of reading up on this literature has become exceedingly low. You can just pick up this one book and read it, and you'll get a very good grasp of like what the live issues are. I really wish they had done this, and I think the sciences would have progressed faster. And so when people started to be all enthusiastic about the economics of happiness, like in the 90s, lots of people made extremely strong claims about the importance of happiness. Okay? So the science of happiness has been around for at least 100 years. It's not actually a new thing. It became really popular in the 90s and early aughts, I guess, following or as a result of the work of some superstars like Ed Diener and Marty Seligman and so on, Layard being one of them. And they affirmed sort of Bentham-like claims in very strong terms. So I mentioned Layard. There's another famous chapter titled Back to Bentham, saying, we should abandon the stuff we've been doing and go back to Bentham. Coming to this as a philosopher, it was pretty clear already then that they were going to have to backtrack like many of these claims because they made these exceedingly strong claims. And that's exactly what happened, right? So 10 years later, these researchers started realizing that the happiness maximization idea was not like quite as good of an idea as they had thought, and then they started backtracking these ideas. They started thinking about well-being as having multiple components, of which happiness would be one, or various modifications. But in philosophy, we've been through this hundreds of years before, right? They could have bypassed like 10 or 15 years of conversation on this just by reading the literature, right? Which is not even that hard. Or they could have like walked across campus and paid for lunch for one of the philosophers who could have walked them through this stuff, right? We're not expensive by and large, right? You can buy us lunch and we'll talk to you about Kant, until your ears fall off. And so again, this is not difficult for a scientist to do, right? It's very, very straightforward. All right. Okay. And here's the last thing I want to mention during this half of the presentation, which is that another thing that philosophy does is to examine how different frameworks or paradigms or images or whatever hang together. By the way, I might mention, I should maybe have mentioned before, that I'm trying to do this in a sort of non-committal way, in the sense that I don't want to commit myself to any one conception of philosophy. I also don't want to commit myself to any one conception of science. What I'm hoping to do is to appeal to as wide an audience as possible by pointing to a number of things that scientists undoubtedly do and a number of things that philosophers undoubtedly do, the sort of claims we can agree on, even if we happen to operate with different conceptions of science and philosophy. And I think you may agree that this is one of the things that philosophy does and does well. Of course, the implicit reference here is to Wilfrid Sellars, who said precisely that the aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. I think this sort of project is becoming particularly important now with increasing specialization. So it's a fact, I think, in the sciences that various disciplines are getting more and more specialized. So there used to be a time when neuroscientists could be on top of all the things that happen in the neurosciences, but now, like, you go to the annual conference and there are what, like 30,000 people at this conference. Is it not humanly possible for one person to know what's going on in neuroscience anymore? Like, people are more and more specialized, and if you're a grad student, you might be feeling this pressure to specialize, right? You might be actively discouraged from reading too much in neighboring fields. You might be told to just focus on your thing, right, to get to get done here. So there's a lot of pressure on people, researchers of all career stages, to like narrow down what they're doing. So what we're looking at is a scenario where people know, one memorable formulation, more and more about less and less, until in the limit, we'll have these people who know everything there is to know about an infinitesimally small part of the science. And I'm not arguing against this, right? Specialization has all sorts of different virtues, but specialization, much like division of labor, works only if there's arbitrage or if there's exchange, right? If people who operate in the one discipline or in the one subdiscipline communicate with people in the other for ideas for us to reap the synergy effects or whatever. And in the individual scientist is pressured into not doing that sort of thing. So there's a need for somebody who sees how the different projects that the scientists are involved in hang together with each other. In the context of the philosophy of well-being, I think this is particularly clear because so many of the people who operate or who do research on well-being or happiness have in mind, I think, quite clearly more or less the same thing. They have in mind the thing that philosophers talk about as well-being, the sort of thing that's good for us, the sort of thing that makes for a life well-lived, the sort of thing that we care about when we care about how somebody else is doing, and the sort of thing that we treat as a currency in comparisons in policy contexts where we have to weigh one person's interest against another. Right? All of these scientists seem to be interested in the same thing. They're interested in that which policy should be designed to promote or enhance or even maybe maximize, and yet they're going about these studies in radically different ways. It will come as no surprise to you that when economists and psychologists of happiness or well-being get together, conversations are not always constructive. Right? There's so many different assumptions that go into the ways that people study this. The assumptions are radically different. They're often not articulated. If you travel from the one discipline to the other, you often have this experience like traveling to a foreign country because people do all these weird things that you don't understand. And it's only like when you've immersed yourself for long enough that you begin to see like what they're doing and what they're thinking about it and why and how and so on. Now, what I want to suggest is that this is like one principal aim of philosophy is to check how these different things hang together, what we can learn about well-being from the psychology, what we can learn about well-being from the philosophy and the economics and how these things hang together. It's something we do, I think, as philosophers, and something that we do quite well. All right, so here are some reasons to think that the practicing scientist has reason to look into what the philosophers are up to. So there are lots of things I'm not saying. I'm not saying that there's always like a ready-made answer, like pre-packaged in a philosophy book that the scientists can borrow and take with them. But there's certainly reflection to be had, and some of it is quite productive. And there is a sense in which philosophers actually agree on many interesting and relevant things that the scientists could take advantage of. All right, but now let's move on to, oh yeah, okay, so right. So scientists don't have the option of not relying on philosophy, right? The option that they do have is whether they want to rely on the best available philosophical theorizing or whether they want to wing it, okay? You can wing it, but what happens if you wing it is that you're likely to express some view that's completely obsolete, and that's obsolete for a good reason. And if you put it this way, I think it's quite clear that it's better for the scientists to try to proceed on the basis of philosophically justifiable positions rather than reaching for whatever comes to mind. Okay, or that's my view anyway. All right, here's the second half, which is this claim that the science of well-being is relevant to the philosophy of well-being. Like the first half is relatively easy, I should say, to convince people of. So among philosophers anyway, it's people are quite happy to be told that philosophy matters, right? We tell each other oftentimes that what we do is really relevant to people outside of the department, and it is, right? That's good. This bit is harder for many people to swallow, the claim that what happens in the sciences might matter to the philosophers. Okay. First off, would anyone ever deny this? Well, yes, and there are lots of people who deny it. So first off, there's this traditional view of philosophy as the queen of the sciences. Right? So this is a depiction that goes back to the Middle Ages, where philosophy here being depicted as a queen sitting in the middle of this image is surrounded by these deferential figures around her who are the sciences. And the idea is that she generates wisdom there. The wisdom radiates from the center and outwards, which means that the sciences benefit from the reflection and the wisdom that philosophy generates. Down here, you have Socrates and Plato, by the way, who are like communicating the insights in a language that the scientists, with their limited powers, can understand. But the influence is unidirectional, right? The influence in this picture goes from the center and radiates outwards. The scientists benefit from the wisdom of philosophy, but the radiation does not go in the opposite direction, right? In this picture, philosophy has nothing to learn from the sciences. And this view is actually not that uncommon among contemporary philosophers. So here's one example of this. It's a philosopher called Fred Feldman, who wrote a book, what is this thing called Happiness, which is really like an interesting book. On the one hand, it pays extremely close attention to what happens in the sciences of well-being. He spent a lot of time reading the scientists who do this to tease out what sort of philosophical assumptions underlie this project and whatnot. So he's really done us a great favor looking at this so closely. But the funny thing is that even though he spends so much time as a philosopher reading this empirical literature, at the end of the day, he really doesn't think any of it matters to the philosophy. So what he says is this. There are many instances in which it's alleged that some body of empirical research has important implications for some long-standing philosophical question. The suggestion seems to be that philosophers had better pay more attention to the work of their colleagues in psychology or economics, lest they embarrass themselves by being ignorant of important findings that bear directly on their philosophical work. This suggestion meshes nicely with the current science worship prevalent among some philosophers. His cautionary tale here is Dan Habron, who's done a lot of work on the philosophy of well-being in a way that's sensitive to the empirical findings. So Habron thinks it's really important for philosophers to pay attention to what the empirical facts are, but Feldman thinks that's a cautionary tale. Now Feldman doesn't say explicitly that it's all completely irrelevant. He sort of hedges his bets. He says, I haven't said that the empirical research in positive psychology is pointless or irrelevant to philosophical questions. Maybe there's some other researcher who has discovered something that bears on some philosophical question. In spite of the fact that I have looked, I have not found. I doubt that it will be found. Okay. Notice that he's not talking about logical implication, right? He's not saying that the empirical results don't logically entail philosophical conclusions. Like nobody believes that, to my knowledge. He's saying that it's not relevant, right? It has no bearing on, which is a much weaker claim. And even so, he denies it. But what I want to do next is to give you some reason to disagree with Feldman here and to say that there actually are some pretty good reasons for philosophers to pay attention to what the empirical results are. What are those results? Well, again, I'm going to talk about these in order from less controversial to more controversial. And so I'll start here. Like philosophers routinely make claims about the well-being of the poor, old, sick, and so on, and about various trade-offs that we face. So in the applied ethics literature, for example, right, if you look at euthanasia, philosophical discussions of euthanasia, or philosophical discussions about abortion, and so on. Right? There are philosophical assumptions in these papers, right? There's like utilitarian principles and stuff. But a large part of the argument hinges on claims about how good it is for a person to be handicapped, if it's or disabled. Sorry, if it's like better to be dead than disabled, and so on. How severe the disability needs to be for it to be better to be dead, and so on, right? And then there are claims about trade-offs that we face. So here's a quotation from Toby Ord, who's a leading figure in the effective altruism movement, who says that he realized at some point that his money would do vastly more good for others than it could for me. And I decided to make a commitment to donating to the most effective charities I could find. many people contacted me asking how they could do this as well, and so I set up Giving What We Can, which is an organization that encourages people to donate their resources to whatever organization will do the maximum good. And so he's a utilitarian, and notice how strong the empirical claims are that you need in order to sort of complete this project. It's not enough to know that some person would be made better off if they got a little more money, right? He wants us to do the most good that we could. So if you have like $1 and you're going to give it to the most effective charity, you need to know the marginal effect for each and every charity, right? How much good will come from donating here rather than here. And if you're talking about redistribution, like in the context of political conversations and whatever, you need to know what are the total effects of like taking $1 from over here and handing it over here. So economists denote this marginal rates of substitution, and it has to do with the consequences of like, transferring resources from one use to another. And these are extremely strong empirical claims, right, underlying all these conclusions. So if you're in applied ethics, you really can't avoid doing this stuff. And I think much of the applied ethics literature has unfortunately ignored relevant information. So when it comes to the well-being consequences of illness and disability, for example, the stuff that people who are themselves ill or disabled say will vary quite dramatically from the things that people like Peter Singer will say. Right? So when we're talking about the empirical assumptions going into the argument, right, how well off a person is with a certain disability, the people who have the experience of having these disabilities will make radically different claims about the consequences. So there's a philosopher in the UK called Harvey Carell who's talked about well-being with an illness, about the ways in which you can be ill and well off at the same time. This is a thing, according to the people who have the experience and who have the philosophical powers to think about this and to articulate it clearly. Right? There's a literature on this. And if we're going to do normative ethics or applied ethics that depends on like empirical assumptions, as applied ethics will, right, it's irresponsible not to pay attention to the best available information relevant to those claims. Right? You can't do applied ethics without paying attention to the facts. And there's some information out there generated by scientists that are relevant to the truth of those claims. Okay. All right. What else? Here's another thing that I find sort of interesting. The most accepted way to adjudicate between philosophical accounts of well-being requires knowing how intelligent people use the word. So I was saying before that there's a great deal of disagreement about what the correct account of well-being is. Like if you ask 10 different philosophers, right? As always, you get like 11 different answers about what it is. But given the disagreement about substance, or the accounts of well-being, there's a remarkable amount of agreement on how we're supposed to go about settling these sorts of questions. So there's a metaphilosophical claim about how we determine which account is better than another that finds a great deal of agreement. There's no like consensus on this, right? But a remarkably large number of texts on well-being will start off by affirming like some version of this claim. Here's Neera Badwar in the Routledge handbook that I showed you earlier. She starts off by saying that we assess our philosophical theories by asking the question, does the account sufficiently closely match what we mean by a life of happiness or well-being in everyday intelligent discourse and literature? That is, like how we use this term, how we apply it in everyday intelligent discourse, not like in philosophy seminars, but in everyday conversation. Wayne Sumner is maybe most famous for articulating this principle. In his book, Welfare, Happiness, and Ethics, he wrote that the basic test like for any account of well-being, for any theory about the nature of well-being, is easy to state. The best theory about the nature of welfare is the one which is most faithful to our ordinary concept and our ordinary experience. Much of this has to do with like how we apply the word in everyday conversation. So what's remarkable here is that a number of philosophers actually agree not on like, the correct theory, but on how we are supposed to go about determining which theory is the best theory. And notice that the story here is based on empirical assumptions, right? about how people use the words. That's a straight up empirical claim of a sort that we could explore with traditional scientific means, right? Linguistic analyses of various ways. Now, what's interesting here is that we have a pretty good estimate of like the number of people who have affirmed the importance of knowing how people use the word, and the number of people who then proceeded to study, in all seriousness, scientifically, how people use the word. And the estimate is exactly 0. There's not one philosopher who has said this and who's then gone on to study seriously and scientifically how people use the word. Isn't this remarkable, right? We have this entire philosophical literature that people have contributed to for generations, where people will say things like this without apparently even like once stopping up and asking how people use the word. Of course, what happens is that people introspect, right? And they say to themselves, well, how would I use this word? And of course, what happens there, or actually, I'll get back to that, but never mind, right? It's interesting. Now, maybe somebody will say, but it's not clear how we would study this. And that's not true. It's totally clear how we would study this. And in fact, people have studied this. So here's a paper from 2017 called True Happiness, the Role of Morality in the Folk Concept of Happiness. And here's a bunch of researchers at Harvard and Yale, Colorado Boulder, who came up with a number of different scenarios, vignettes, hypothetical scenarios that they presented to like real human beings. And they asked, like, to what extent is this person happy? You can ask these questions in lots of different ways, right? I don't want to get bogged down in the details of the study, but it's a serious study published in a very serious journal. And what they find is that the way that intelligent, ordinary people use the word happiness is nothing like the way normal philosophers use the word. So for one thing, the concept, the everyday concept, is deeply moralized. So if you're a moral human being, people are much more likely to say that you're happy than if you're not. Okay, so if you describe a person who's like in good spirits, like in good cheer, helping little ladies cross the street, people are much more likely to say that they're happy than a scenario where this person's mental state is described in the same way, but he's happy because he was just torturing kittens or something that he enjoys doing, right? So the concept of happiness as normal people use it is nothing like the concept as philosophers use it. And this should not surprise us, right? If you're in a philosophy seminar and it occurs to you to like do empirical studies by asking the other people in the philosophy seminar, you're really terrible scientists, right? This is one of those cases where diversity of the profession really matters. If everybody else is like a middle-aged white guy, middle class, whatever, Bill asking Bob how Bob feels about this, and Bob saying, I agree with you, Bill. These are two people who are like drawn from a very narrow subsection of society. They've also been socialized as philosophers, possibly for 30, 40 years, right? I don't even remember what my intuitions were before I started studying philosophy. I doubt that anybody does, right? We don't know how we felt about this before we were corrupted by philosophical reflection. And we can't do the science of this by polling our friends in the same profession, right? That's awful, awful science. And yet, so many of these philosophers are fully committed to the view that we assess these accounts based on how people use the word, right? Now, I'm not saying that for every empirical question that pops up in the philosophical literature, there's an off-the-shelf answer to be had in the scientific literature, right? So that's obviously not true. But if that's the case, if you're a philosopher and you're really tempted to make some sort of empirical claim, there are lots of things you could do. You could go to the literature and look at the best available evidence, and you can say, hey, here's the best available evidence I can find, and it supports my view, assuming that it does. You could also like team up with some scientists and try to do the study. And so there are lots of scientists who are looking for things to study. And if you have a good hypothesis, like a philosophically motivated project, you might be able to pitch it to somebody and collaborate with them on a study that determines whether it's true or not. But even if that's not an option, and maybe it won't be, at a minimum, it seems to me that intellectual honesty requires us to flag the claims that we make without any basis. Right? And this is not like me telling philosophers to do anything differently, right? We're already committed to making our premises clear and explicit and trying to defend them to the extent possible. And if our arguments are going to hinge critically, right, as in this case, on some empirical claim about how people use the word, like at a minimum, we ought to be honest enough to say, here's an empirical claim. My entire theory is based on this empirical claim, and I have zero empirical evidence to believe that it's true, right? That's what we ought to be saying, but obviously nobody does. Okay, I'm getting worked up here. Here's another way in which sort of empirical facts matter. Another way to adjudicate between philosophical accounts is to ask which one does the work we expect it to do in philosophy, science, and beyond. So this is a different view about how we assess philosophical accounts. So one view is, as I said, just check, like, does this philosophical theory match the way people use the word in everyday discourse? That's one way to go about it. Another way to go about it is to ask, what sort of work do we expect this philosophical account to do? Like, what are the things we want this concept for, and which of these available concepts does the job best? This is not an unusual view by any stretch of the imagination. So here's James Griffin in his book, Well-Being, which is a huge classic from the mid-80s, where he says we can't just ask, like, what's the best account of well-being, as if best could mean most accurate. Our job is not to describe an idea already in existence independently of our search. Before we can properly explain well-being, we have to know the context in which it is to appear and the work it needs to do there. One proper ground for choosing between conceptions of well-being would be that one lends itself to the deliberation that we must do, and another one does not. So here you need to ask yourself, like, what is the deliberation that we must do? What is that? Like, well, in policy context, there are some questions we want to address. Many of those questions tend to be answered in terms of well-being. Okay, so that's a domain where we expect the concept of well-being to do some work. We could talk about that, right? We can explore what sort of work is it supposed to do here? What sort of criteria need to be satisfied for a philosophical account to do that sort of work? And we could use that kind of information to assess which one of these competing accounts is the best one. It's not even like Griffin was the first to say this. I think you get the same idea, more or less, in Aristotle. Right? So Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics has a passage where he's criticizing Plato's theory of forms. I completely missed this passage until I reread the book like a few years ago, and I was really struck by this passage where he says, moreover, it's a puzzle to know what the weaver or carpenter will gain for his own craft from knowing this good itself, or how anyone will be better at medicine or generalship from having gazed on the idea itself. This strikes me as a really radical idea, right? So he's looking at Plato's theory of forms, and he says it's deficient because it doesn't help the carpenter or the weaver gain proficiency at their craft, right? It doesn't help you become a better general. It doesn't help you become a better farmer. It doesn't help you become a better cobbler. And even if Aristotle doesn't consider that a knockdown argument against the theory of the forms, he certainly considers it relevant to the question, right? It seems to matter to Aristotle whether learning this philosophical theory will help you become better at some of these practical tasks. And that's certainly something we could ask, right? We could ask questions about well-being. Suppose you study a philosophical theory of well-being. Does it help you do anything? If you're a medical doctor, does it help you make the sort of judgments you have to make? If you're in palliative care, for example, right? You'll do a lot of judgments of well-being. Does the philosophical theory help you make those sorts of judgments or not? It's a question you could ask. And it has a certain empirical flavor, right? Does this account do this work in this context? It's something that you have to study on location. Again, it may not be something that people in fact have studied, but it's something that we could study, right? We could gather information relevant to it. And if you agree with this general line of thought, then that's certainly interesting. All right. Here's another thing. Another thing we can do. We can look at the way in which philosophers of well-being works with examples. Like, you guys are all familiar with the happy slaves and the subjugated housewives, the dispossessed laborers and whatever. In the context of arguments about hedonism, it's particularly common to operate with these claims about whether slaves can be happy, for example. This is something that Fred Feldman talks about a lot in his book. He talks about a subjugated housewife, Bertha. So I Googled housewife Bertha, and of course the first 12 images were like, not safe for presentation, but then this picture came up. Okay, so here's Bertha. She's, according to Feldman, according to the thought experiment, she's unable to recognize that her life is demeaning and dehumanizing. And the question is she happy? Well, Feldman is a hedonist. He wants at the end of the day to explain well-being in terms of happiness and happiness in terms of pleasure. So to him, it's a big problem. Like, if somebody like this who lives a life that we would intuitively judge not good, right? If she can be happy, Feldman's theory suggests that she's living a great life, and that doesn't seem quite right. So he takes this example very seriously. He dedicates several pages to exploring whether a person like this can be happy or not. And here are some of the things that he says. He says, the example of Bertha is psychologically implausible. It's doubtful that the socialization process that she endured could have been so perfectly and painlessly successful. Elsewhere, he says, if her life is so hard, then surely there must be lots of things in which she takes displeasure. And further down, it's reasonable to suppose that if she had taken advantage of the freedom to choose her lifestyle, she would have taken pleasure in a much richer variety of interesting things. So all of this to Feldman goes to show that she couldn't possibly be happy if her life was truly as bad as we've been asked to imagine. But notice what sort of claim this is, right? He's not saying that the notion of a happy housewife is like logically impossible or incoherent or inconceivable or anything like that, right? He's saying that it's psychologically implausible, which I take to mean something like inconsistent with, principles of psychology. It's doubtful that the socialization process could have been so perfectly and painlessly successful. Well, is socialization painlessly successful or not? Well, it's a straight up empirical claim, right? Sort of thing you can study. If her life is so hard, then surely there must be lots of things in which she takes displeasure. Again, it's an empirical claim. There are lots of things in which she takes displeasure, conditional on an account of pleasure, right? We can ask, is a person living this sort of life experiencing displeasure in that sense? And so understood, it's an empirical claim. So Feldman is making like pages and pages of empirical claims about somebody in Bertha's situation. Is there any evidence? Well, there's exactly zero science cited in any one of these pages. And he cites 3 philosophers in this context, like no empirical evidence whatsoever. What we get instead of like empirical evidence, like studies of the sort I showed you, is a certain shift in the way he introduces these propositions. So early on, he says, it's reasonable to suppose that P. And then he goes on talking about this, and further down he says, well, so surely P. And then at the top of the next page, he says, it is a fact that P. So you get this shift from like, we might be able to suppose to it's a fact, surely only by introducing the surely operator in the middle, right? Which is not how we reason. All right, so here's, again, a whole series of empirical claims that Feldman makes in the context of his purely philosophical argument, right? He's trying to establish a theory of well-being, which I take it everyone will agree is a philosophical project. And yet in the context of this philosophical project, he cannot not invoke these empirical questions. And in fact, like if you removed all the empirical claims from this passage, there would be no argument left, right? So these empirical claims are relevant to his case in the sense that they figure as premises in his argument. And the premises are not, you can't omit them, right? They're critical in that way. All right, what else? I'm going to keep moving up like the meta ladder here, right? So I talked about philosophical accounts of well-being. Then I talked about metaphilosophical principles concerning how to select between philosophical theories. Now I'm going to talk about meta-philosophical principles having to do with how you select between meta-philosophical principles. And here, a number of philosophers have argued that the proof is really in the pudding. So we have these meta-philosophical principles. One says that you should assess these theories by comparing the theory to how people use the word. Somebody else says you should assess these theories based on like whether the concept allows us to do the sort of work we want it to do. And the question then arises, like, how are we to select between these meta-philosophical principles? So there's a philosopher called Mike Bishop that some of you may have read, who has a really amazing book on the good life, where he says that the way to assess meta-philosophical principles is to look at what the consequences are. And what he gets at in a slightly different way is that many philosophical debates have roughly this character. So you're watching this little game here, and you see things happening, and then like it looks as though somebody has the lead, but then maybe not so much. And then after a while, you realize that so many of these debates are just going in circles, right, for years and years and years. And the way he diagnoses this is that he says that people with the Aristotelian-like intuitions tend to become Aristotelian philosophers, and they nurture Aristotelian intuitions, and consequently, at the end of the day, they defend Aristotelian theories, whereas people with consequentialist intuitions tend to become like consequentialists, and then they nurture their consequentialist intuitions, and they talk themselves out of the other ones, and then they use their intuitions to confront their theories with, right? And what you end up with is this polarized profession with different communities of people who don't share intuitions and don't share theories and whatever. That's not a very good way to go about settling these differences, he says. The point here is not, to sort of endorse this idea, although I do endorse it, but only to say that there's an empirical claim here too, right? It may not be the sort of claim that scientists have studied, but it's nonetheless a claim about what happens in the profession when you adopt the one principle versus when you adopt the other one, right? They have consequences. We can look at those consequences and we can use information of those consequences as premises in our arguments about which metaphilosophical principle is worth endorsing, right? So what's the point here? Well, one point, or the central point, is that philosophers often can't avoid relying on empirical facts. Now, I'm not saying that every philosophical project requires, some empirical claim or something. I recognize that there are philosophical projects that you can complete without paying attention to the facts. But there are many projects that we would, I think, agree on are philosophical projects, such as Feldmans coming up with an account of well-being, where the way we do this, the way we play this game, requires us to pay attention to empirical facts. Again, I'm not saying that empirical facts would logically entail philosophical conclusions. What I'm saying is that the empirical facts are relevant to the conclusions in the sense that they appear as premises in our argument, and as premises that we cannot eliminate without doing major damage to our case. So again, we don't have the choice of not relying on empirical claims. The choice we have, if we're involved in this sort of project, is either to draw on the best available empirical research or to wing it, right? We can look at the available evidence and try to make some inferences based on obviously imperfect evidence, or we can just make something up, or ask our friends and they will make something up, right? That's not, I think, a very good way to go about it. All right, so what's the punchline here? Well, the punchline is that there's a certain kind of symmetry, right, in the way that scientists use philosophical claims and the way in which philosophers use empirical claims. So the upshot is that science and philosophy stand in a symbiotic and symmetrical relationship, with scientists and philosophers engaging in a mutually beneficial exchange of ideas for the advancement of the general knowledge. So the opposite, I guess, would be a commensalistic relationship, which is a relationship like that between a tree and the orchid that grows on it, right? That's really, it's not a parasitic relationship because the tree isn't harmed by having an orchid growing on it, but the orchid requires the tree to grow on if it is to flourish at all, right? The other view is that of philosophy being the tree and the sciences being the orchid, right? And that's the view that I'm rejecting here. Philosophical arguments sometimes can't help but proceed from empirical premises, and scientific arguments sometimes can't help but proceed from philosophical premises. By and large, if you're making empirical claims, you ought to be supporting them with empirical evidence. If you're making philosophical claims, you ought to support them with philosophical argument. When this is true, it's appropriate for philosophers to support the premises, the empirical premises that they make, with the best available scientific evidence, recognizing that the best available evidence might not be conclusive and so on, right? Or failing that, at least to flag that they're making empirical claims that have no evidence supporting them. And it's also appropriate for the scientists who depend on philosophical claims to rely on the best available philosophical argument, right? And there are certainly better and worse arguments out there. Indeed, I think it would be irresponsible to rely on such premises without making some effort to confront them with systematic scientific evidence in the one case, or systematic philosophical argument in the other. Now I want to leave you with another quotation from Bunge, where he says, "My ideal will not be attained by preaching philosophical or scientific sermons to the scientists or the philosophers, but by making an effort to understand them. I suggest that philosophers or scientists should become apprentices rather than lawgivers and participants rather than onlookers." And this is also my recommendation in light of all this. Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Chris?
So thanks so much.
So this is also just a very broad brush question, but I'm curious about the state of the field as you see it. So this seems like an area that has a number of different fields, philosophy as well as competing scientific fields that are touching upon it. And you've given us a few different visions. It's fairly clear what you would prefer, but I'm wondering like what your sense is of the state of the field. Is it that we're going to have the moral sciences returning and we'll have a new Sedgwick perhaps? Or is it more like what the economist you quoted at the outset, where there's maybe one area of science that has a more active research agenda and they're sort of taking over? Or, you know, what's the picture of the field, and then how do you see the philosophers contributing in light of that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I should say right away that the quotations I had on the screen were sort of deliberately selected for being extreme, right? So Hirschleifer is not representative for all economists, and Feldman is not representative for all the philosophers. There certainly are lots of people who endorse these views, but that's not universally true. And so there are lots of scientists who do pay attention to what goes on in neighboring disciplines, and who do pay attention to, you know, to the extent that they can, what the philosophers are doing. There are also institutions like regular conferences in places where philosophers and scientists get invited and where people talk to each other, not always fruitfully, but at least people try, right? And I want to think that the general trend is in that direction. So there's a lot of interesting interdisciplinary work, and maybe I'm just revealing my own biases here, but it seems to me that the most exciting work and the most interesting conclusions come out of that sort of liminal field between the different disciplines. People are certainly beginning to see that it matters what happens in the other fields, and people are beginning to talk to each other. So that's sort of where I see the trend going. But it could go faster, and I guess that's what I'm trying to do with this. And speaking about institutions, I mean, there are also more and more institutes like this one, right, where philosophers and scientists live relatively happily under the same roof, and where students in the one discipline go off to take courses in the other and whatnot. And all of these are encouraging developments that I think are really shaking up the way we do this.
I just wanted to ask about the scope that you, the scope of the claim that the empirical literature should constrain philosophical conclusions. So the example you gave was that the philosophy should respect, the philosophy of well-being should respect the ordinary usage of well-being. And then you criticize people for not trying to figure out what that is, but it should conform to the ordinary conception of what well-being is. So that's a claim about that it should apply to the central concept of the philosophical literature. To what degree does that also apply to maybe counterintuitive consequences that might come from philosophizing about that central concept? Is the constraint that it has to conform in some way to ordinary usage in a broader sense, or just at the central concept? You can be with some concept, then discover unexpected things.
So I think your question is for Barbara more than for me. So I didn't endorse that principle. I just put it up there saying that it's very common, even among philosophers who disagree about the nature of well-being. Sumner has an excellent, thoughtful discussion about this, where he says that, of course, we're not going to expect like one philosophical account to completely match what everyone's doing, and so we have to make some sort of holistic judgment, and then there'll be some claims we make that feel like we make them with more confidence, and we'll be more concerned with preserving those judgments than we are with preserving some other more peripheral judgments about well-being and so on. And so there's an active discussion about this among people who sort of endorse that principle. I tend to be more with Bishop. I think it's more interesting to look at like what sort of work does this concept do, and which one of the philosophical accounts serves us better. So this is a longer story, but I think about the analogy with probability, for example. So if you want an account of probability, or if you want to figure out what the axioms of probability are or whatever, you could go out and ask people what their intuitive judgments of probability are, and you're going to get a massive mess, right? Or you could ask yourself, well, what do we want this concept for? Well, we want it for doing statistics, right? We want it to do accounting. And then you ask yourself, well, what sort of axioms will allow us to do the sort of work we want to do in statistics? That seems to me a more helpful way to go about exploring the nature of probability than confronting theories with intuitive, untutored judgments. And I said this at some point to an experimental philosopher, and he called me a fascist for thinking we should pay attention to what the elites think more than what like the regular folk think. But anyway, so there's an active discussion about this that we could maybe talk about afterwards.
Can I ask you a question? Yeah. So I actually want to defend Sumner to some degree.
Oh, good.
And the quote you gave was, about the ordinary concept, and then no attempt to back out. And one of the distinctive things about the book is it's one of the first books written that actually engages lots of the social research indicators, literature, lots of the social scientific literature, and actually tries to work out an account of well-being according to which it's authentic life satisfaction, which kind of matches what lots of people in the literature, in the scientific literature, were doing, and also kind of relies lots on literature and things like that. So it was an attempt, I think, in some ways, to kind of move beyond, say, what you find in Griffin, which was a book written a decade earlier, which we didn't really have anything, about the empirical literature. It's not only a book on well-being, but didn't have almost anything on the sort of scientific literature, nothing kind of outside of the sort of, what Parfit had said, a few years earlier in his appendix to Reasons and Persons. So I kind of think that sort of that's one sort of good thing about the Sumner book, is it opened up the idea that philosophers who are working on this should really engage that kind of thing. But maybe that's just sort of an attempt to kind of
I sort of agree. If I may just I think it's a great book, and I really enjoyed reading it. It was just so surprising to me to get to this point in chapter 11 or something where he says that it's all pointless, for philosophical projects. So here he is, a philosopher, having just written like so many chapters about this in exquisite Feldman, in exquisite detail, and then at the end he says, nothing of this matters.
Well, you said in the sort of foreword to the book that he tried to reach out to people in psychology and they stopped responding to his
but that's the reason to endorse the one philosophical theory rather than the other. But anyway, so I didn't want to dismiss the book. I think it's a great book. It's just really interesting how he evidently depends on empirical claims of all sorts of kinds, and without any evidence at all. I have a paper specifically on this where I do try to look up the evidence, and it turns out that the evidence does not support his claims, or to the best of my ability. Right? The evidence suggests that you can be perfectly happy even if your life is, demoralizing and demeaning, which is, of course, Amartya Sen's point. So when he talked about the subjugated housewife in the Indian context, based on his experiences of living there and working there, like his point was that it's possible to be a lower caste woman, live a life that, we in our ivory towers would judge demoralizing and demeaning and bad, and nonetheless, have her affirm that she's living a great life and she wouldn't change anything and so on. Right? That's the whole motivation for Sen, right? Sen also doesn't give like a ton of empirical evidence, but at least he's been on location. Feldman just denies that without offering any evidence at all in support of his claim, which strikes me as surprising.
I just wanted to follow up on the example and the analogy with probability, because the idea sort of, and I guess this is the way the experimental philosophy tradition works, which I just don't find all that appealing, but you sort of start with an ordinary language concept and you hope to elucidate what that is. But I don't see that there'd be any reason to think that there's a coherent concept of well-being that's underlying the ordinary language, just as there's no coherent concept of probability that you could elicit in that way. And so, that's sort of a negative, I guess, argument that maybe that's what's persuaded you not to take that sort of metaphilosophical position.
That's part of it. In fairness, though, Sumner sort of sees this, right? So he recognizes that there will be a huge gap between stringent philosophical.
Right. There might be some sort of reflective equilibrium.
Right.
Some
take like the best one.
Yeah.
And we can't just do it by listing assertions and like checking them off. We have to make some sort of judgments about like which is a core concept and which one isn't. Right. So, there's a procedure for doing this, and it's not a silly idea, right? It's not a silly idea at all.
But I guess just to push a little bit, are there specific reasons for thinking that the concept of well-being that you would arrive at by that procedure is incoherent? Like I could imagine filling out the argument that if you try to elicit a concept of probability, that you get something that's incoherent. That there's sort of well-known heuristics that we use, and sort of reasoning that lead to something that can't be generalized in the way that we would the axioms of probability. And so with well-being, is there something like that where you say, here's reasoning about well-being that we know is subject to what from a more formal point of view are clear fallacies, so that if you try to use sort of ordinary language conceptions of well-being, you'll end up running into these problems.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I could see that being true. I'm fully satisfied that it's going to turn out to be true. I don't know anyone who's done the serious sort of scientific study about that, but that seems like something you could do. I mean, what they do find, the people who have done this, is like a great deal of disagreement, right? They certainly don't find people agreeing on all these judgments. There are differences. Right. And I imagine that if you look at this, you might find like cultural differences too, right? There might be systematic ways in which people make different judgments. All of that would be interesting from a scientific point of view, and it might also be philosophically relevant for at least some philosophical projects, I guess is everything that I'm saying.
How radical are the implications of your argument for the status of moral philosophy? The reason I ask is because it seems like the standard argument in an ethics paper is something like, here's some thought experiments, here's some intuitions, and it's sort of taken for granted that we will generally have that intuition. And it seems like you'd be pointing out, like, look, that needs empirical support, right? That's an empirical claim. It seems like the status of moral philosophy right now, then, is that the vast majority of arguments in the field are missing something very fundamental for the argument to work. So that would seem to suggest like there's something really profoundly wrong with the way moral philosophy is proceeding right now. Is that what you want to say? Or?
Yeah.
No, I had a similar thought specifically relating to intuition pumps and their use in ethics without going out and actually trying to say like, well, let's test to see if anybody has these intuitions other than like a small group of philosophers discussing amongst themselves. So yeah, if you just accept that.
I mean, intuitions are interesting because none of these like official views give any weight at all to intuitions, right? Sumner doesn't mention intuitions, and I find in many moral philosophy contexts, people do nothing but confront theories with their own private intuitions, and so that's another sort of gap.
To be used, so it's the judgments about those things, but how is that different from just having?
Maybe they treat themselves as an indicator of like the majority or something. That's certainly conceivable. But maybe I should clarify that, you know, I do intend this to be like relatively radical. I'm not making any claims about like institutional organization, right? So I'm not saying we should shut down philosophy departments and I'll move into the psych department or the other way around, right? I'm not talking about that sort of thing at all. I think I think the philosophy and science are like distinct activities. I'm glad they're pursued as such in universities and whatever. I do think we should cross these boundaries more often. And of course, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys already do, right? But I think we should do this more often. And I do think that a large chunk of moral and social and political philosophy really ought to be completely rewritten, or at least confronted with like actual evidence. I'm in seminars so often where I feel like the entire seminar is about like some empirical claim, but no one is like making the slightest effort to confront it with evidence. And so to the point where I shut up now, right? Because I'm asking the same question in like every seminar, like, you know, isn't that an empirical question? Like, is there any evidence about that? Have you looked at this? And it gets boring to repeat yourself. But yeah, I mean, if you take this sort of view seriously, I think, you know, we really have to do moral philosophy in a quite different way.
Do you know of much testing on maybe really crucial cases in ethics? I think I've come across some, like with like drowning child type cases, or actually no, I think it was with trolley cases where they've done some kind of cross-cultural.
Yeah, so the empirical philosophers have done, the experimental philosophers have done great work on all sorts of thought experiments, right, where they confront people with thought experiments. So for you know, metaphilosophical reasons, I don't think at the end of the day that sort of question is as interesting as the question of like, what does this concept do for us? So I'm more with Aristotle and Griffin here than with Sumner and Badwar. But to the extent that philosophers are depending on empirical claims about people's intuitions and how they apply these concepts and whatever, there's beginning to be research out there that you can tap into. There are methodologies that are perfectly established that you could just borrow off the shelf if you wanted to do the study yourself. And again, at a minimum, what we should expect from philosophers who are committed to like articulating their assumptions and defending them and so on is that people flag the assumptions they're making without any evidence.
I think this is just a follow-up to the probability thing. I started thinking about there, in the case of developing probability theory as we know it, a big role was played with games of chance and things where you really you knew what job probability was supposed to do, and then you could use the applications to then refine and get a concept that would do those jobs. Is there any way to hope for something maybe not as mathematically articulable as that, but that would do a job like that for well-being? And what I was thinking from your talk at the library, the caregivers in things, there must be a lot of stuff they have learned about details that make a difference in the right way. And I'm wondering if, I mean, that's just one sort of thing, but about things, what sort of things we might look for. And again, I mean, the psychology test, would you say is as good? That is one thing, but the sort of specifics about how to make things better and are ways we can pick up things from which those that seem to work and which ones don't. That might be something that could do a job analogous to what games of chance did for probability.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. This is exactly the right question to ask, right? So you're exactly right. I hadn't thought through this analogy properly, but in the case of games of chance, there were specific questions, like how many times do you have to do this to get an even chance of winning, this prize or whatever. And so there were very clear, distinct questions that people were trying to address, and they developed the theory in order to answer those sorts of questions. And then there's like some degree of empirical testing you could do to check, right, some of those assumptions. And so the question to ask then is, what are the analogous questions in the context of well-being? Like, what are the challenges that we need a philosophical account to address, right? If the philosophical account is completely idle, then we can go off and explore it in some other way. But there are, presumably, like, as philosophers, we're committed, I think, to the idea that there are like real judgments out there that hinge on like philosophical assumptions, certainly what I've argued. And sort of getting a clear handle on what those questions are would be a fantastic first step toward figuring out what sort of criteria the proper account have to satisfy. Yeah, great, thank you.
In that kind of case would be very different than the sort of trolley problem kind of cases, right?
Yes.
It would be, could you say a little bit, I mean, it's a kind of richer context in which you can develop an account, right? And see, you have a concept and you put it into play, and what can it do for you, as opposed to using these as sort of counterexamples.
Yeah, so it's a very different project, really. So, of course, the trolley case has now been studied for so long, so there are lots of different wrinkles on it. But, very often the object there is to figure out, like, under what circumstances people say it's okay to, like, pull the trigger, and under what circumstances it isn't. And then you vary all the different details. You vary the number of people, and you vary the scenario, and you push in the one scenario, and you pull in the other. And you get a good handle on the judgments that people make. And that's a fine research project, but it's a little different from the one you're suggesting here, which strikes me as really kind of more promising. If your question is, how are we to assess these alternative philosophical accounts of well-being, for example?
So just a general comment on your project as a whole, which actually might be worth a point you making as you sell this idea, which is that the project actually of confronting intuition with empirical justification might actually, and there's evidence for this, might actually have as a beneficial side effect addressing the gender imbalance in philosophy. Because there's evidence that, I'm thinking about Sarah Jane Leslie, and again, in fact, the American Philosophical Association has done studies that the people who tend to continue in philosophy are the ones that share the kind of dominant intuitions. And it just turns out that young men are more likely to share the dominant intuitions than young women. And so there's a way in which challenging the authority of intuitions might actually have a direct social impact on makeup of the discipline.
Yeah, in the sciences, over the course of the 20th century or something, the trend was definitely away from intuitions, right? We started off with like introspective psychology and just noticeable differences and whatever, and we completely abandoned that and went to like empirical testing and whatever. And I guess what I'm advocating in a way is the same sort of procedure in philosophy where we move away from reliance on these dominant intuitions. And yet, to the extent that moving away from them will also make the discipline more welcoming for a wider population, that would certainly be a massive, unexpected, positive benefit. And there'd be this feedback loop, because I was talking about how, like, this is one of those cases where the lack of diversity in the profession is a real problem, right? If everyone's the same, everyone's going to have more or less the same intuition. It's going to look as though everyone agrees. A case in point is the experience machine, where Nozick says something like, surely you wouldn't plug in, right? And I don't know how many seminars and classes I've attended where somebody says, I wouldn't plug in. Would you plug in? I don't think so, right? And everyone around the table agrees. But then at some point, Philippe de Brigard, who was then a grad student at UNC, came up with the idea of like polling people, and he polled his PhD students, or undergrads, sorry. And what he found was that Nozick wasn't at all right. Lots of people are willing to plug in, so younger people. In a way, this is not surprising, right? Young people have been known to like do drugs and things that alter experiences. Young people play computer games that are increasingly vivid. But the other thing that he found was that the responses are very strongly responsive to the framing effects. So how you ask the question has a huge effect on what people's responses are. And that's also relevant, right? If you're in the philosophy setting and you always frame the question the same way, the way Nozick did it back in 1970, was it, Jan 3? You've only tested one framing, right? And you can't know on the basis of your intuitions that things would be different if the question had been asked differently. But now we know, because de Brigard did this study, right? And that told us a lot about intuitions or responses to this sort of scenario. And it's certainly relevant. Again, those sort of empirical studies don't logically entail any philosophical theories, but because claims about intuitions figure importantly in all sorts of arguments, the truth of those claims are certainly relevant to, the soundness of the argument. Great, thanks.
So I'm curious to know whether you've convinced any economists with these arguments. Like, has it made a difference to the way scientists or economists are thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm thinking about, maybe everybody knows this, but like the logical positivists, when they met, had like a list of propositions they were going to discuss, and then they took a vote before the discussion and a vote again afterwards, and each individual was color-coded. And so in the little minutes, there are like dots representing each individual, and we can track now, 100 years later, in real time, like when Carnap changed his mind on some particular proposition. And I guess that I should have done something like that when I started with this, right? I don't really know.
But it's also that yes, no, and you can just deny that the proposition has any sense.
Exactly, nonsense, right. And then there's this general phenomenon where people will say no, 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 and then they'll switch and they'll say, but of course, right? That's what I've always said. And so you have to be very careful if you want to track how people's changes. You asked about economists. You didn't ask about philosophers. You want to know about philosophers? Or yeah, I don't know if I've changed the minds of any philosophers. I have some empirical evidence, but the paradox, of course, is that if you don't pay attention to empirical evidence, then empirical evidence won't sway you and persuade you into taking empirical evidence seriously. Thanks.
I'm sure most people were at your lecture yesterday, but I just wanted you to...
Could you speak up just a little bit?
I just wish he would reiterate some of the points that he made last night at his other lecture. I know most of you were there, but of course today it was very different. And still the two things are related, the science of well-being and science of happiness, but science of happiness is definitely more empirical. So can you just make some of your points again? So to bring things up for people to ponder on, not just to focus too much on what you're saying today and forget some of the stuff that you've mentioned.
Like about the empirical findings from the psychology of happiness, that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
So one thing that's relevant actually is sort of these findings. So one of the things that I talked about yesterday, for those of you who weren't there, were sort of empirical findings that coheres with like pre-existing expectations, right? And empirical findings that don't. And one of the things that surprise people are these findings on health, where whether health and happiness are correlated depends on how you understand health and how you measure it. If you look at people's subjective conceptions of how healthy they are, there is a strong relationship between how healthy they say they are and how happy they are. But if you look at like how many diagnoses they have, there are no effects in many studies. Like a remarkably weak effect between like the objectively assessed health state and happiness. And that's interesting, right? If your philosophical project involves defending an account of well-being, where well-being is constituted by happiness, and you're doing this on the basis that you think people use the word happiness in this way, what you're finding is that the concept, as the psychologists use it anyway, gets applied very differently from the way that ordinary people or and philosophers would use that term. Those sorts of things seem relevant to a whole number of philosophical projects. So that's certainly part of it. So yesterday I focused mainly on the ways in which the philosophy mattered to the sciences, and I fleshed it out in some detail. And what I was trying to do here was also turn the turn the case over, as it were, and make the case from the other direction. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, sorry if I'm interjecting again. So how tempted are you to abandon the idea that there's a single unitary concept? So I know in like the literature on emotions, so Paul Griffiths, for example, has taken the line, look, there's just not a natural kind that corresponds to emotions. There's several different things that scientists study, which we sort of routinely call emotions in ordinary language. You can distinguish sort of different types of things that fall under this general level, but there's no single thing that captures all of the things that our ordinary language concept applies to. And so for happiness, is this a similar kind of move that's sort of a multi-dimensional concept, or there's several different aspects of it, and then when you try to measure well-being, you're just trying to measure all of them and combine them in some way?
Yeah. There's a similar trend in positive psychology where, like in the early days, 100 years ago, people imagined that happiness and satisfaction were the same thing, for example. And so they use these terms interchangeably. And then at some point in the 60s, people started looking seriously at responses to these different questions. And what they found was that the correlations were not as high as they had expected. And they drew the conclusion then that happiness and satisfaction are really two different things that correlate some, but not perfectly. In the case of health, when you look at correlations like the ones we were just talking about, and you get like very different correlations based on whether you're measuring it in the one way or the other way, the temptation there is to say that there are really two different concepts of health, right, that we need to distinguish between. And so the general trend is for concepts to like multiply into many, and that's good. When it comes to well-being, of course, like one kind of job we want the concept of well-being to do is in the context of ethics, right? So if you're a utilitarian, for example, right, you're committed to the idea that there is that unitary thing of well-being that you have and that's comparable across people, such that you could average across individuals or like add it up and maximize it in some way. And so this is where like the job you want the concept to do is kind of, have. Exactly, it's going to force certain kinds of concepts, and how this is going to play out, I have no real idea. But at this stage, the most important thing is to be clear on what's related to what and what's relevant to what, and that's certainly a first step. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I think we're at the end, are we? 3:30.
Okay.
Okay, so before we clap, I'll give you the bag of swag, or the swag bag. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our speaker.